Good evening. I'm Ankit, and you're watching the Daily News Simplified. In today's DNS, that is 21st of December, we have picked up 6 different topics. The first 4 topics are on prelims related discussion, and we'll start off with the issue of disinflation. Because disinflation, it has been going on around at various places at a different pace. And this would mean that the global growth rate in the next year is appeared to be slowing down. And in this article, we will discuss various terminologies such as disinflation, deflation, skewflation, and stagflation. As these terms, they are very much important from UPSC perspective. The second discussion will be on the Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board, which is PNGRB, as this is a sectoral regulatory board which is responsible for approval of various contracts. Now the third discussion will be on Ramayana Circuit, because the Bihar government, it has launched a developmental plan for goddess Sita's birthplace, which is located in Panora Dham, which is in Sitamarhi, Bihar. And this Panora Dham is a part of Ramayana Circuit. Hence we'll discuss what is this Ramayana Circuit. The fourth prelims related discussion will be on the issue of greenwashing, because the United Kingdom's its ad regulator, it has banned advertisements which were from airlines, as it led or it misled the consumers regarding the environmental impact of the air travel. Then we'll proceed to the mains related discussion, and the first related discussion is on the telecom sector in India, because the Lok Sabha yesterday it passed the telecommunication bill of the year 2023. And this key legislation, it replaces 3 laws which were majorly legislated in the colonial era. And this particular legislation, that is telecommunication bill, it proposes significant and far-reaching changes in India's telecom sector. Hence, we will take up the India's telecom sector and we'll give a detailed discussion. The second related topic is on the issue of Multilateral Development Bank, because during India's G20 presidency, an expert independent group was formed which gave suggestion regarding reforms in this multilateral development bank. And yesterday, the World Bank it established a task force which will go through or examine the recommendations by G20's expert group. Hence, without further ado, let me also highlight the importance of liking this video, sharing this video with your known aspirants, as well as hitting the subscribe button if you want to stay updated related to our future updates. Hence, let us start our today's discussion with this first article of the day, and it appeared on page 17 of the Hindu newspaper. Now this article it reports that disinflation it will pave way for interest rate reduction across the world, and it might lead to even slow down the global growth process. Now, in this discussion, we will discuss various terminologies such as disinflation, deflation, skewflation, and stagflation as they occur in the news reports regularly. Now, the first term, that is disinflation, it means a gradual reduction or reduction in the inflation rate in an economy. For example, if the inflation rate last month, that was November, was 6%. However, in December, hypothetically, if it reduces to 5%, this signifies a process of disinflation, which means reduction of inflation. Whereas on the other hand, deflation is also a continuous reduction in inflation. However, what separates disinflation from deflation is that in case of deflation, the rate of interest or the rate of inflation is in negative territory. For example, if the rate of inflation was 1%, it will be not termed as deflation. However, if the rate of inflation was minus 0.5%, then this will be categorized as an example of deflation, because the inflation in this regard is in negative territory. Hence, from this graph, you can see that inflation means sustained increase in inflation. Whereas, if the inflation reduces, it means disinflation. And if it continues to decrease and goes into the negative territory, it means deflation. Now, what is skewflation? Now, this skewflation means the increase in inflation rate may be due to one or few commodities. For example, current inflation in India can be attributed to increased prices of pulses as well as edible oils. Hence, you can say that this particular kind of inflation, which is in India currently, and it is because of pulses and edible oils, hence, they are selected group of commodities. Thereby, it means it is an example of skewflation. Now, what is stagflation? It is defined when there is an inflation in the economy and it is accompanied by slow economic growth and high unemployment, which are examples of stagnation, then you can see that this is called a stagflation, which means stagnation is accompanied by inflation. Thereby, this is stagflation, where inflation is combined with slow economic growth as well as high unemployment. Hence, after we have discussed this particular terms, let us now solve the model question. And why are we dealing with this particular model question? It is because UPSC, it frequently asks various effects of inflation. Hence, we have curated this practice question on the term disinflation itself. Now, price which is skewed to one or small group of commodities, it is not disinflation. Rather, as I've already highlighted, it is an example of skewflation. Thereby, option A is not the correct answer. Whereas inflation, which is accompanied by slow economic growth and high unemployment, it is an example of stagflation. Hence, it is also incorrect as this is not disinflation. Now, the third or C option, it says that fall in general prices characterized by a negative rate of inflation, it is termed as deflation. Hence, C also is not a correct option. Thereby, naturally, option D is the correct answer. As disinflation, it means slowing down the rate of inflation over a period of time. Whereas answer to this PYQ was option D. Now let us move to the second article of the day, and this article it appeared in page 17 of the Indian Express newspaper. Now this article highlights that Indian Gas Exchange, it is planning to launch small scale LNG trading contracts. But to get the approval of this measure, the IGX, it has applied to Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board, which is the regulator of this particular sector, which is petroleum and natural gas. And this topic is important because UPSC in its GS paper 2, it highlights statutory, regulatory and various quasi-judicial bodies. Hence, let us first discuss what is this Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board. Now, this Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board, it was formed after a passage of an act which was Petroleum Natural Gas Regulatory Board Act of the year 2006. Thereby, this body is statutory in nature because it is originated from a statute which was passed by Indian Parliament. Now, this body discharges various functions. For example, it wants to protect the consumer's interest by encouraging fair trade practices by the sectoral players. Further, it also undertakes registration of entities which wants to market petroleum products or build or construct storage terminals for both petroleum products as well as natural gas. I'm sorry. This PNGRB, it also undertakes regulation of the petroleum and natural gas sector. And in this regard, it provides access to companies to establish natural gas distribution facilities. Further, in terms of petroleum products, it also ensures adequate availability and it also monitors the prices of petroleum product. However, when this body finds that a player it is involved in a restrictive trade practices, then this body it can also take corrective measures. Further, this body it also ensures regulation for equitable distribution and fair pricing of petroleum products. Now, the key aspect is to understand that this body monitors the prices, however, it does not fix the prices of petroleum products. Now, who fixes the prices of petroleum products? It is the oil marketing and gas marketing companies themselves who fix prices of petroleum products. However, this body, that is PNGRB, it monitors the prices and ensures that these prices are not unfair in nature. Further, this body it is also ensuring that the technical standards and specification for construction of various gas and petroleum terminals they are also regulated. Hence, it ensures the safety and security of the petroleum and natural gas sector. Now that we have covered what is this Petroleum Natural Gas Regulatory Board, let us solve the model practice question. And why are we dealing with this practice question in the first place? It is because UPSC in the year of 2019 it asked a question on the Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board itself. Hence, let us solve the practice question. And the first statement of the practice question it states that the PNGRB it is a non-statutory body, which I have already highlighted is an incorrect statement because this body was formed by Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board Act of the year 2006. Now the second statement it says that it regulates and authorizes entities for building city gas distribution networks and LNG terminals. Now this previous slide it shows that it undertakes registration of entities who construct storage terminals for both petroleum and natural gas. Thereby this second statement is correct. The third statement, this body regulates the pricing of retail petroleum products like petrol and diesel. Now, as previously I have already highlighted that it is the oil marketing companies themselves who regulate the pricing, but this PNGRB it monitors and not regulates the prices. Hence, this third statement again is incorrect. Hence, from this above discussion, we can safely conclude that option A is the correct answer to this practice question. Whereas this 2019 PYQ is concerned, here option B was the correct answer. Now let us move to this third article of the day, which appeared in the explained section of the Indian Express newspaper. Now this article it highlights that the Bihar government it has recently launched a development program for development of Sita's birthplace that is located in Panora Dham in the city of Sitamarhi. Now this particular news article it highlights the state of Bihar connection with the importance of Indian or Hindu religion, that is Hindu religion. And also this place that is Panora Dham it is an integral part of the Ramayana Circuit. And this particular news article it is important from GS paper 1 perspective, which deals with the Indian heritage and culture. Now let us discuss the importance of Sitamarhi. Now this Sitamarhi according to various historical literature it is a birthplace of goddess Sita. For example, Ramayana which was written by Valmiki this also highlights that the Panora Dham it is the birthplace of goddess Sita. And this was also corroborated by Sir William Wilson Hunter's publication that was a statistical account of Bengal and its volume 13th. As this particular literature, both of them, they highlight the importance of Panora with respect to Ramayana and also it is the birthplace of goddess Sita. Now, to improve the various tourist locations, the government of India it came up with a Swadesh Darshan scheme, and this particular scheme it was launched by Ministry of Tourism, and this scheme it provides the development of India's various tourist places. For example, this scheme it is a central sector scheme. That means 100% of funding of this scheme it is provided by the central government itself. Now this scheme it wants to undertake a community based development of various significant tourist places. And this means that this scheme will create awareness among the local communities about the importance of the tourism for their local places, as tourism will result into increased source of income, improve living standard and overall development of the particular area. And also this scheme wants to improve the tourist facilitation services, which is aimed to enhance the tourist overall satisfaction as well as experience. Now this scheme it implements various kinds of circuits, and Ramayana Circuit is one of 15 circuits under this scheme. And there are 15 destinations which fall under this Ramayana Circuit, and each and every one of the destinations I have provided in the notes itself. Hence, after the class, you can go after or look at these 15 sector schemes which are located throughout the India, not just in northern parts, but also in southern states such as Tamil Nadu. Now, the projects under this Ramayana Circuit, it is implemented or these are selected based on the consultation with states and union territory governments. Now, after we have looked at this particular news article, let us now solve the model question. The first statement of the model question, it states that the Ramayana Circuit is to be developed by Ministry of Culture under the Swadesh Darshan scheme. Now the Ramayana Circuit, it has been developed under Swadesh Darshan scheme, but it is developed by Ministry of Tourism and not Ministry of Culture. Hence this first statement is incorrect. The second statement, it says that the Swadesh Darshan scheme is a centrally sponsored scheme with equal fundings from center and state governments. Now again, this statement also is incorrect because it is a central sector scheme, which means that the funding to this scheme it is provided just by the central government. Now the third statement, it says that the Panora Dham in Bihar and Mahendragiri in Odisha are selected destinations under the Ramayana Circuit. Although this statement is factual, but both of these locations are part of Ramayana Circuit, and the exact 15 locations have also provided in the notes. Hence this third statement is correct. Thereby the correct answer, or how many of the statements given above are incorrect. Hence you need to understand that this question is asking you to identify incorrect statements. Now these two statements are incorrect, thereby option B is the correct answer to this model question. Now the previous year question, which was in the year 2022, and it asked question regarding to Somnath temple, the answer to this particular question was option A. Now let us move to the last prelims related discussion of the day, which also appeared in the explained section of the Indian Express newspaper. Now this news article, it deals with the term called greenwashing. As this greenwashing term, it was particularly asked in the 2022 prelims by UPSC. Hence, let us discuss what is this terminology, that is greenwashing, and how it is relevant for the airline sector in general. Now, as you've already known that this greenwashing term, it is utilizing or it determines a false impression which is usually given by a company or a government for their products or services. As the companies, they often highlight that they are providing environmental friendly products or are undertaking environmental friendly activities, which makes them more attractive to people in general. However, these claims can be sometimes misleading in nature. Hence, this term it is called greenwashing, or trying to or pretending for a products to be environmental friendly. Now, this case it imposes this news article. It highlights that the UK ad regulator it has banned certain advertising by the airline companies, which highlighted that the airline industry itself it is environmental friendly. However, the aviation industry in general, it is a high emitter of greenhouse gases. For example, this aviation industry, according to the Environmental Panel of Climate Change, it emits almost 2.5% of carbon dioxide, which is produced by all human activities. Now, if this emission it is not checked in future, then the projected increase in emissions it is expected to be around 5% of total human carbon emissions by the year 2015, and some estimates it also highlight that it might even rise to 15% of CO2 emissions. Hence, you can see if unchecked, this aviation industry will be responsible for a high percentage of carbon dioxide emissions into our atmosphere. Now, if the emissions it occurs from domestic flights, then this emission they are added to a country's account of total emissions. However, that's not the case in terms of international flights, because for international flights it is the emissions of international flights it is not added to a country's own emission account. Rather, it is termed as a bunker fuel, and no international country has to take the responsibility of curtailing international flights or its emissions. Hence, you can see that this greenwashing it is a key role or a key factor which might try to make you understand that a particular industry it is involved in environmental friendly practices when they are not. Hence, let us solve this model practice question because the term greenwashing it appeared in the prelims of the year 2022. Now, with reference to greenwashing in the aviation sector, consider the following statements. The first statement, it says that the greenwashing it may occur when a company highlights sustainable aspects of a product to overshadow its environmental damaging activities. From the above discussion, we can safely say that the first statement is correct as it exactly describes the process of greenwashing itself. Now, the second statement, it says that the emission from the international flights are attributed to a distant country, which again is an incorrect statement because no country has the responsibility of describing the emissions of an international flights into their own account. The third statement, it states that the aviation industry it is responsible for approximately 23% of all human produced CO2 emissions. Now, as I've already highlighted, though the contribution of aviation sector it is quite high, but it is only 2.5% of all human CO2 emissions. Hence, the third statement is incorrect. Thereby, the answer to this model question is option A, as only first statement is the correct statement. Whereas the PYQ is concerned, here option A was the correct answer. Now let us move to the first mains related article of the day. And this article it demonstrates that the Lok Sabha of India, Indian Parliament, it passed the telecommunication bill of the year 2023. Now this bill it aims to bring far reaching and significant change in the India's telecom sector, because this bill it provides for administrative allocation of spectrum. Along with it also simplifies the licensing process and it streamlines the process of obtaining different permits. Hence, you can see the changes which is envisaged by this telecommunication bill it aims to further spur the growth in India's telecom sector. Now, the topic of our today's discussion, of our first mains related discussion, is the telecom sector of India. And why are we dealing with this particular news article? And why are we taking up this particular topic for our mains related discussion? It is because UPSC in GS paper 3 it deals with the issues of infrastructure. And the infrastructure development of telecommunication, it is very much essential for forwarding the vision of digital India. As internet services all across the globe, they're delivered by these telecom companies, and adding or improving their infrastructure, it is key for the sector's growth. Further, different issues of infrastructure, for example, railway infrastructure, it was asked in the UPSC mains of the year 2014. So you can see the infrastructure development of across the country and sectoral infrastructure, they are important from mains related point of view. Hence, let us start our discussion on the telecom sector of India. But first, let me give you an overview of how important this telecom sector is for Indian economy as well as its India's image across the globe. Now, Indian telecom sector, it is world's second largest by size, as there are total of 1.17 billion users, which means 117 crore telecom users across the country, and this include both wireless as well as wired telecom users. And also, India's internet penetration, it is second largest globally, as by March of the year 2023, India had almost of 88 crore internet users. Hence, you can see the amount of internet user in India itself, it is much more than the total population of many countries. Thereby, the health of telecom sector in India, it is very much important from Indian people and Indian economy in general. Further, this particular telecom sector, it also witnesses high amount of foreign direct investment, and it total 6% of foreign direct investment in India, it is done in this telecom sector itself. Further, from the year 2000, this sector, it has witnessed more than $39 billion of foreign investment. Also, this sector, it provides employment to almost 40 lakh people, as 22 lakh people, they are directly employed in the sector, whereas 18 lakh people, they are indirectly employed. Hence, you can see not just the size of this telecom sector is enormous, but also this sector, it provides employment to 40 lakh people in the country. Therefore, the rapid transformation in the sector, especially with introduction of 4G and 5G and increased internet penetration in India, it means that the health of telecom sector, it is very much important from the Indian economic point of view. Also, the importance of this sector is that it provides infrastructure to other sectors as well. For example, transportation sector or transport vehicles, they require to be communicating with each other, which requires telecom sector. Also, this sector is important for development of education, healthcare as well as banking sector also. Thereby, the linkages that this telecom sector has, it is wide, pretty much wide across the Indian economy. Now, what is driving the growth of this telecom industry? And the first important factor is that there's a robust demand for telecommunication services across the country. And let me give you an example to demonstrate how high is India's demand for telecommunication services. For example, back in the year 2014, India on an average had a monthly per subscriber usage of internet, it was just 66 MB. But coming back to the year 2023, India's per subscriber usage of internet, it has reached 17.36 GB and not MB. Hence, you can see in the span of just 9 years, India's use of internet has grown enormously. And this increase in demand, it can be attributed to two particular reasons. First reason is that India has a significant amount of young age population who have high aspiration, thereby they want to use the internet for their daily activities. For example, if a youth wants to watch a YouTube video, or he wants to surf the internet or use the photo sharing site, that is Instagram, it also requires high amount of mobile data. And who is providing this mobile data? It is the telecom sector companies. Further, Digital India, which has brought digital infrastructure across the country in form of payments, identification, as well as government services, access to those digital services, it also requires internet connection. Thereby, there's a robust demand for increased internet as well as telecommunication services. And this robust demand, it is driving the growth of telecommunication sector. Further, Indian government, it has supported the telecommunication industry through various aspects of its policy making. For example, Indian government, it brought policy changes in its taxation regime in order to reduce the financial burden on the telecommunication industries. Also, to promote the growth of manufacturing of telecommunication products, Indian government, it has brought PLI scheme for not just design and development but also the manufacturing of mobile phones and other digital gadgets. Hence, this provides a stable policy support or handholding by the government itself. And this policy support again is driving the growth of India's telecom sector. Further, this sector has witnessed increased investment in the country. As for example, through the budget of financial year 2023 and 24, the Department of Telecom, it was allocated more than 97,000 crore rupees for provision of telecommunication services. And out of this 97,000 crores, government has provided rupees 5,000 crores for just Bharat Net program. As this program, it wants to install fiber cables across the Indian country. Thereby, not just through policy support, but also investment in building infrastructure of the country, government is providing a fillip or driving the growth of telecommunication sector. However, there are many challenges that India's telecommunication sector currently is witnessing. What are these challenges? Let us discuss them in the next slide. Now, the first challenge which is plaguing the telecom sector, it is related to the finances. For example, telecommunication companies, they have to share a certain percentage of their annual gross revenue, which is termed as AGR, with the government. And this kind of a revenue, it is under two forms, that is spectrum usage charges as well as licensing fees. Now, there has been a debate or disagreement between the government and telecom service provider of what constitutes this AGR or annual or adjusted gross revenue. As these telecom companies, they gain revenue or profits from telecom related activities, but also from non telecom related activities such as renting out their premises. And according to government, the earning of the telecom companies and the calculation of this annual gross revenue, it should include both telecom based revenues and also non telecom based revenues. Hence, you can see or understand that the government, it wants a broader definition of this adjusted gross revenue. But on the other hand, the telecom companies, they are of the opinion that the government should only calculate the telecom revenues for calculating this adjusted gross revenue. Thereby, according to telecom companies, they favor a lesser broad AGR. And this has created a difference between government and telecom companies. However, Supreme Court, it ruled that the definition of this AGR, it should include not just telecom based revenues but also non telecom based revenues. And this means that the total burden of AGR on the telecom companies, it reached almost 92,000 crores, which is a huge amount. While on the other hand, a telecom company or all the telecom companies, they have to pay this huge amount to the government in form of AGR. But the revenues of the telecom companies, it has taken a hit recently because these telecom companies, they are engaged in rivalry with other over the top services. As for example, WhatsApp offers mobile calls through the internet, which means if you're using WhatsApp calls, there it also means that you don't have to provide for the charges to the telecom companies for using their network for mobile calling. And this means that the telecom companies, they'll witness a loss in revenue in general. Further, there is also a stiff competition among telecom companies, which means they have reduced their tariff rates substantially. And all these amounts, they have resulted into a negative impact on their finances. Thereby, telecom companies in general, they have almost rupees 3.6 lakh of debt in its entirety, which is a huge amount. Further, huge debt on the telecom companies, it means that the capital expenditure by telecom companies, they have also become quite low. While on the other hand, these telecom companies, they also need to spend more on infrastructure development as well as understand or undertake the generational shift in their services. For example, providing 4G and 5G services, it also requires updation of their telecom equipment as well as installing various kind of different digital or fiber networks. However, if these companies, they are under the huge debt obligation, this means that they'll go slow on their capital expenditure, thus affecting India's telecom sector in general. Further, these telecom companies, they also witness a difficult policy environment. As I've already highlighted, government, it is undertaking high amount of spectrum usage charges and licensing fees, which increases the debt burden on these telecom companies. Further, these high regulatory dues, it means that the companies, they are going slow on their capital expenditure. Further, the spectrum availability in India in general, it is also low when you compare with other developed and developing nation. For example, spectrum availability in India, it is almost 40% less than European Union and 50% less than China. Hence, lower the amount of spectrum is available, it will also hamper the delivery of telecom services by these telecom companies. And also these telecom companies, if they want to expand, they want to obtain a right of way permission from both public as well as private properties. And this right of way, it means, for example, if you have a building and a telecom company, they want to install a mobile tower on the terrace of your building. Thereby, this telecom companies, it has to enter an agreement with that particular building owner to provide right of way to their infrastructure development. However, if this right of way requirement, it is quite procedurally difficult, it will mean that the expansion of telecom services will be much slower. Hence, due to difficult right of way requirements, these telecom companies, it is facing difficulties in expanding their mobile networks. Thereby, this is an example of how difficult policy environment can hamper the progress of telecom sector. Also, to increase the penetration of mobile services, these telecom companies, they have to install various telecom equipment. However, most of these telecom equipments, they are sourced from external markets, which means that the import dependence of these telecom companies, it is quite high. For example, almost of $40 billion worth of telecom equipment, it was imported by these telecom companies. And this is also an example of how import dependence it adds to the cost of telecom services in general. Further, India also has a somewhat lower rural penetration of telecom services. For example, there's an important indicator of the penetration of mobile services and it is known as tele density. For example, how many mobile connections are there in an area per square kilometers, it is called as a telecom density. And for example, India's overall telecom density, it is 84%. And however, this is much more skewed in favor of urban areas. For example, every for every 100 people in urban areas, there are almost 133 mobile connections. While on the other hand, for every 100 people in a rural area, the mobile connection are somewhere between 57 to 58. Thereby, this shows that the penetration of mobile services in general is very much low in the rural areas. And this is because of two factors. For example, to provide mobile services in rural areas, these companies they have to install mobile infrastructure that are towers and fiber network in rural areas, which will again add to their service cost. And also the amount of skilled labor which is required to maintain these telecom services in a rural area, it is also quite difficult to find. And this further increases the low rural penetration of mobile services in India. Therefore, a stressed finance or stressed balance sheet of these telecom companies, it leads to low capital expenditure by telecom companies. Further, these telecom companies they are also facing a difficult policy environment which creates hurdles in order to enhance the expansion of the telecom networks. And if they want to expand these telecom network, they have to be dependent on imports for getting those equipments. And also, expansion of mobile networks to rural areas, it also faces certain challenge in terms of increased costs and non-availability of skilled labor. Now, what steps have government taken in order to reduce these challenges in general? Let us look at those steps in the next slide. Now, recently, government it announced that there will be moratorium on various dues that are liable on these telecom companies. For example, government it said that there will be a 4-year moratorium on payment of AGR dues by these telecom companies. And also, these government it gave the telecom companies an option to convert their debt into equity. And as a result, government it has acquired some kind of a stake in Vodafone India company as a part of this substantial measure. Further, government has also said that the interest in delayed payment it will also be calculated based on MCLR plus 2%, which was before MCLR plus 4%. Thereby, you can see that government it has also reduced the amount of interest which will be payable by these telecom companies. Further, government it has also allowed these companies to hold airwaves or spectrums for an increased amount of time, and these measures they are aimed at reducing the financial pressure that were there on these telecom companies. Further, government it has also rationalized or made the licensing process much more easier. For example, these telecom companies they had to obtain license from the government in order to provide wireless services. However, currently this licensing requirement has been replaced by just self declaration. And these procedures they are aimed to provide ease of doing business to these telecom companies, which will facilitate increased investment in the telecom sector in general. Further, spectrum auctions they were taken before at much more increased timelines. However, government has also introduced a change in terms of fixing the calendar of spectrum auctions. and these spectrum auctions will take place only in the last fiscal year, last fiscal quarter of a particular year. Thereby, when government has fixed the calendar of these spectrum auctions, it will be much more easier for the telecom companies to secure financing in order to pay for these spectrum auction charges. Further, government it has also eased the FDI norms as far as telecom sector is concerned. As before, there were only about 49% of investment that was permittable through automatic route. However, government it has now provided 100% of foreign direct investment under automatic route, which will further spur the investment in the telecom sector. Now, as far as right of way was concerned, government has also eased the rule so that the telecom companies they can easily get the right of way for enhancing their telecom services. As these amendment they have rationalized the charges for this right of way rules, and it also has made installation of telecom infrastructure much easier, thereby by moratorium on due payments, easing the licensing procedure, fixing the calendar for I'm sorry, fixing the calendar for auction, easing the FDI norms, as well as rationalizing the right of way rules. Government has somewhat made the situation of these telecom sector companies much more better in a recent years. Now there are further more suggestions that the government should incorporate in order to spur the growth of telecom sector. And what are these charges? Let us look at those charges in the next slide itself. For example, there's a currently duopoly in the telecom sector, as most of the services in telecom sector they are either provided by Airtel or Reliance Jio. And there are two more players which are much more marginal in nature, that is state owned BSNL as well as Vodafone India. Hence you can see that the current telecom sector in India it is duopolized by just Airtel and Jio. And hence, in order to improve the telecom sector in India, what government should do is it should also encourage other players to increase their investment in the telecom sector. And the first suggestion in this regard is to curb the predatory pricing which these two companies are currently involved in. As these two companies, they have reduced their amount of tariffs, which will further increase the burden on these companies as they have stressed financial strain, which will mean that they will not be able to provide services at a lower cost. And if this predatory pricing continues, then on longer term, it will mean that these companies will go out of business. Hence, for the health of telecom sector in general, it is much more necessary that there are many more companies that offer telecom services. Hence, by curbing the predatory pricing which is there currently, the government should also encourage healthy competition in the telecom sector. Also, as I've already highlighted before, the reserve prices for spectrum currently they are quite high, and this means that the financial burden on telecom companies for booking or getting this spectrum currently it is quite high, which has led to large debts accumulation by the telecom companies. And this large debt it inhibits these companies to make capital expenditure. Thereby, if the government it reduces this prices for spectrum, it will mean that the spectrum will then be available to telecom companies at much more lower prices, which will reduce their debt burden in general. And this debt burden in general, it can also be reduced by enhancing the self reliance for technology in the Indian industry. And if these Indian players they are able to get these technological infrastructure and equipments from the local market itself, it will reduce their capital expenditure costs. Also, government it should look to ease the burden on finances of these telecom companies. As government, it can permit these companies to share their infrastructure with other companies, which will enable these companies to provide the telecom services at enhanced user base and at also much lower prices. Further, these companies they can also be encouraged to provide value addition in their telecom services, as by providing value in addition, it will increase the revenues of these telecom companies, thereby reducing their stress on their finances. Further, the government it should also aim to provide these companies with long term relief, and in this regard it should reduce the levies and taxes which are there on the burden which is there on these telecom companies in general. Thereby, by curbing the predatory pricing by few telecom companies, reducing the reserve prices for spectrum auctions, improving or enhancing the self reliance for technological support to the sector, and also reducing the burden on their finances will help the government to enhance the growth and development of the telecom sector in general. Hence, this was all for today's discussion on telecom sector in India. And with this, we move to the last mains related discussion of the day, which is on the multilateral development banks. Now, these multilateral development banks, they are banks which are installed or instituted by two or more countries. And during India's presidency of G20 this year, there was formed an expert group which suggested reforms that should be undertaken for effective functioning of these multilateral development banks. And to consider the recommendations of this expert committee, the World Bank yesterday it formed a task force which will assess the recommendations which were given by the expert committee of the G20. And this particular news article it highlights the importance of multilateral development bank for global economic and inclusive growth. And this multilateral bank and the topic it is also important from UPSC perspective, because UPSC in GS paper 2 it deals with important international institutions, agencies and their structure and mandate. And across the world currently there has been demand especially from developing countries to undertake reforms in the workings and structure of these multilateral development banks. Further, a question related to multilateral development banks such as New Development Bank as well as Asian Infrastructure Bank, it appeared in the mains of the year 2014. Hence, you can see that this particular news article it is important from the mains point of view. Now, what are these multilateral development bank? As these multilateral development bank, they are international financial institutions which are established by two or more countries. Now, these banks in particular, they extend or they have an objective to promote economic advancement, especially in low income and middle income countries. And these development banks they pool funding from member countries which may be usually developing or developed countries. And these countries they pool their funds and they give these funds to a multilateral development bank which then provides finances for various development projects. These projects they can be infrastructure development project, but they can also be projects in social sectors such as education and healthcare development. And these projects they are aimed to enhance the economic growth and development of especially low income and middle income companies countries. Now these banks they offer different kind of financing for different countries. For example, these banks they offer non-concessional finances in form of loans to middle income countries as well as private companies. Further, these multilateral development banks they are also engaged in providing concessional finances in form of low cost loans as well as grants to low income and small island development states. Hence, these banks they form support both in non-concessional and non-concessional forms. And what are these multilateral banks? Let us understand with the help of an example. The most important multilateral development institution across the world is the World Bank, which was established after Bretton Woods conference. And this Bretton Woods institution, it also includes International Monetary Fund. However, there's also emerged new regional multilateral development banks, especially Asian Infrastructure Bank, Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, as well as New Development Bank, which was introduced by BRICS. Hence, these are the examples of multilateral development banks in general. Now, how are these banks relevant for developing countries in general? For example, these developing countries they require finances for development projects in general. As these countries they are middle or low income in nature, thereby for their development they require infrastructure development in form of roads, railways or other forms of transport. Further, these countries they also require finances for development of social sector, especially education and healthcare. However, being a low or middle income country, it will mean that the budgetary support that the national governments can provide, it will invariably be somewhat lower. Thereby, these countries they also require high amount of infrastructure and social sector investment, which are then financed by these multilateral development banks themselves. Further, in order to implement the construction of infrastructure projects as well as development of social sector projects, it also requires some kind of technical expertise. And these banks they also offer technical assistance to the countries if they want to undertake development of infrastructure and social sector services. Further, these low income and middle income countries they also witness some kind of inefficiencies as far as their revenue collections are concerned. Hence, these multilateral development banks they also offer technical assistance in form of bureaucratic measures which these countries can undertake in order to enhance their revenue collections in general. So not just engineering or policy implementation expertise, these banks they also offer administrative expertise to these countries for increasing their revenue collections. Further, the economies which are of middle income and low income countries they have low credit ratings in general, and these low credit ratings it will mean that if these economies they want to borrow from international sources they have to pay high interest. However, these high interest rate will go against the nature of lending that these countries they usually want. Thereby, what these multilateral development banks they do is that they secure loans from companies and then they extend these loans to middle income and low income countries at somewhat low interest rates. Further, these multilateral development banks they also offer support in times of various crises. For example, India witnessed a balance of payment crisis in the early 1990s. And during this crisis, the IMF it extended loans to the Indian government to deal with this balance of payment crisis. And also, during COVID times, most of the national governments they had to enhance their spendings on healthcare sector. However, due to enhanced lockdowns, these countries they also witnessed low revenue collections. Thereby, they required funding to provide for their healthcare sector, which was then provided to them by these multilateral development banks such as World Bank or Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Thereby, from these above examples, you can see that these multilateral banks they also offer support in times of various crises. And also when these multilateral development banks they invest in a particular economy, it also signals to various investment or investors that these economy will gain certain amount of high economic development, and this encourages them to undertake investment in low income or middle income countries. Thereby, these countries they are providing or facilitating the investment by bringing the private investment in addition to spending by these multilateral development banks. However, these multilateral banks they are also subjected to some form of criticisms also. What are these criticisms? Let us look at these in the next slide itself. Now, the first challenge that these multilateral development banks they face is the skewed nature of their organizational structure as well as policy making powers. Now, these banks they offer usually the finances to low income and middle income countries. However, as far as their organizational structure and policy making powers are concerned, it is currently rest with developed countries such as USA in general. Hence, you can see that there's a skewed nature of organizational structure as well as policy making power in hands of developed countries, whereas these multilateral development banks they are engaged in furthering the interest of low income or middle income economies in general. Further, in order to provide some kind of finances, these multilateral banks they also impose conditionalities in order to get these finances back. And these conditionalities they may be in form of increased tax burden or reducing the amount of restrictions that is there on foreign investment. And this means that the financing countries, which are usually low income and middle income countries, they have to make reforms such as liberalization, globalization, as well as privatization. And these conditionalities it go against the nature of local economies in general, and hence this means that these conditionalities it impinges on the inherent sovereignty which is there in a particular government. Hence this impinging interest and sovereignty it goes against the multilateral nature of these banks, thereby it invites criticism on functioning of these particular banks. Further, these banks they are also subjected to inefficiencies in their day-to-day working, because these banks they have an inherent bureaucratic functioning in nature, and this bureaucratic functioning means that the amount of money that is spent on usual administrative expenses by these multilateral banks they are quite high. Hence, these inefficiencies they have also plagued the working of these multilateral banks. Also, the banks they have been alleged that they are non-representative in nature, because most of the top posts of these banks they are manned by representatives of developed countries. However, as I've already highlighted that these banks they usually operate in low income and middle income countries. Thereby, these banks they have low representation of members from who are nominated by these low income and middle income countries, thereby highlighting the skewed nature of the functioning of these banks themselves. Further, these banks they are also involved in increasingly expanded role. Earlier, especially in late 1940s, these banks they were primarily meant to engage the development of European Union as well as other less developed countries. However, currently these banks they are also involved in providing finances for new age problems such as climate change. However, their structure and functioning is as such that they are mostly involved in problems that were prevalent such as restructuring and development. Thereby, in order to undertake this expanding role, the current allegation on these multilateral development banks is as such that they are unable to play an increasingly effective role as far as their expanded role is concerned. Hence, the expert committee, which was constituted by the G20, it suggested few measures in order to undertake reforms in the working of these multilateral development banks. And what are these measures? Let us take a look in the next slide. Now, the G20 expert committee, it specifically highlighted that these multilateral banks, they should focus on three core areas. The first core area, that these multilateral development banks, they should prioritize primarily on eliminating the amount of poverty which is there across the world. Further, these banks, they should also be involved in enhancing or tripling the amount of this sustainable lending, which should reach the levels of $390 billion annually by the year 2030. And these enhanced sustainable finances, they should be provided in a flexible manner, which means it should be provided in form of grants, loans, as well as private sector funding. Further, these banks, they should also undertake governance reforms in general, which means enhancing the representation, especially of developing and low income countries. Further, these banks, they should also enhancingly engage with private sector in general, because currently the most of the capital that is provided by these multilateral development banks, they are just financed from other governments. For example, for every $1 that they extend in financing, there is only $0.6 which is provided by the private sector in general. And according to the G20 expert committee, this amount should be twice more. Further, as I've already highlighted, there are global multilateral development banks and also regional multilateral development banks. Hence, in order to enhance the effectiveness of these multilateral banks, what these banks should do, that they should enhance or increase the amount of cooperation among themselves. And this amount of cooperation will not just increase their effectiveness, but will also result into inclusive and transparent growth across the world. Further, the workings and day-to-day functioning of these banks, they are somewhat opaque in nature. And hence, to increase the transparency as well as accountability, what these banks needs to do is that they should undertake an independent assessment of their day-to-day functioning. And this in general will ensure that the proposed roadmap that these banks will have, it will be implemented in a more transparent and an accountable manner. Further, as I've already highlighted, that these banks, they are also subjected to enhanced role, such as providing for climate change as well as other climate related activities. Thereby, what is required, that these banks, they should involve in enhanced green lending, and this should be specifically undertaken by an independent arm under these banks. And especially, there should be a green lending arm under the World Bank. Thereby, by undertaking governance reforms in form of enhanced representation, especially of developing nations, engaging private sector more, increasing the cooperation among international and regional development banks, undertaking independent assessment, and specifically focusing on green lending will enhance the effectiveness of these multilateral banks in general. Thereby, this is all for today's discussion on our multilateral development banks. And with this, I'll also request you students to ask their comments in the comment section down below. I'm waiting for your questions, students. Now, I cannot witness any of your questions. So, if you have a question in the future, please ensure to ask that question in the comment section down below. Now Shivangi, she's asking me to explain what is MCLR. Now Shivangi, let me go to that particular slide. Now Shivangi, MCLR or marginal cost based lending rate is a form of lending rate which these banks use to calculate how much amount of interest should be there on a particular product. And this MCLR, it was recently or a few years back, it was adopted by these banks on instructions of RBI. Now the scope of this discussion, Shivangi, is specifically related to the economy question. And these questions are quite technical in nature. However, later I will also give you an answer in the comment section down below. So please ensure that this question, it is also asked by Shivangi in the comment section down below, and we'll try to address your question somewhat later, because this question, it goes out of the scope of our today's DNS and its discussion. However, this question, it is also very much important from UPSC perspective. So Shivangi, I'll address your question later in the comment section below, but please do ask this question again in the comment section. And with this, I'll conclude the today's discussion on DNS. We'll see you again tomorrow at 6 p.m. sharp. Until then, good night.